future, the near future. As the New York Times says, blasting away is one of Ms. Wolf's great strengths. She firebombs with knowledge and authority.
And you're tuned to 94.1 KPFA in Berkeley, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno. And welcome also to all of you listening online worldwide at kpfa.org. It's about a minute past 1 p.m.
This is Guns and Butter.
There's something happening, yeah. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there.
Considering that there's an $800 billion giveaway to be followed by another trillion and another trillion after that, this is the biggest giveaway since the land giveaway to the railroads in the mid-19th century. And just as that giveaway created a power elite that would rule America for a century and a half, this is creating a new power elite that has changed America from a democracy into an oligarchy. And as Aristotle said, what is democracy but the stage immediately preceding oligarchy?
I'm Bonnie Faulkner. Today on Guns and Butter, Dr. Michael Hudson. Today's show, The New Kleptocracy. Dr. Hudson is a financial economist and historian. He is president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trend, a Wall Street financial analyst, and distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. His 1972 book, Super Imperialism, The Economic Strategy of American Empire, is a critique of how the United States exploited foreign economies through the IMF and World Bank. He is also author of The Myth of Aid and Global Fracture, The New International Economic Order. Dr. Hudson has written several articles on the recent Wall Street meltdown and Secretary of the Treasury Hank Paulson's plan. These articles have included Financial Bailout, America's Own Kleptocracy, the largest transformation of America's financial system since the Great Depression. The Paulson-Bernanke Bailout. Will the cure be worse than the disease? Financial Fraud, Mr. Paulson and the New Yazoo Land Scandal. And Thinking the Unthinkable, a Debt Write-Down and Jubilee Year Clean Slate. Dr. Michael Hudson, welcome again.
Thank you very much, Bonnie.
Secretary of the Treasury Hank Paulson's $700 billion so-called bailout, first called the Plan, was defeated in the House. Then a modified version called Troubled Asset Rescue Plan, or TARP, was passed by Congress in its Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. Still others refer to this legislation as cash for trash. What would you call it?
Cash for trash is exactly what it was, and the emphasis should be placed on emergency for emergency plan. It was rushed through without giving any opportunity to debate. Dennis Kucinich protested, for instance, that this was the first time a major plan that was going to create the equivalent of 700 billionaires, people who were going to become the next power elite to govern America for the next century, that this act was done without any hearings, without specialists, despite hundreds and hundreds of major economists throughout the world saying that it was a disaster and a giveaway. It is cash for trash. It will not resolve the problems. The dollar will plunge. The stock market already plunged. It is purely a giveaway to Mr. Paulson's colleagues on Wall Street and a giveaway to Mr. Obama's and Mr. McCain's campaign contributors. The Democrats were the major supporters of Mr. Paulson, while even the Republicans sought to dissociate themselves from the plan so that they couldn't get blamed when the inevitable failure of the plan shows that all that was done was a giveaway of $700 billion to Mr. Paulson's colleagues and pals on Wall Street.
Well, now, what and who are being bailed out? People now are saying it's a $700 to an $850 billion revolving money fund.
The Secretary of the Treasury said that he really just picked the amount out of the air. There will be another $700 billion next month, another $700 billion after that. Trillion after trillion will go to create a financial elite of kleptocrats. What's happened here by Mr. Paulson of Goldman Sachs is almost a mirror image of what the other Goldman Sachs Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, did in Russia. He's creating and endowing a class of kleptocrats by giving them liquid Treasury securities in exchange for basically worthless junk. It's actually called the Worthless Assets Recovery Program, WARP. And this is pretty much what was done in Russia to create Russian kleptocrats, in Russia's case, they gave state ownership of raw materials and fuels, oil, other assets to individuals who then diversified their portfolio by selling as much as they could to the West and taking their money out and putting them into dollars and sterling and euros. What's happening here is that the Wall Street beneficiaries are going to take the money and run and put it in safe economies such as Russia, China, and any other non-U.S. economy they can find. The result will be a huge capital outflow, a capital flight that will push downward pressure on the dollar.
You know, Dr. Hudson, I was just about to ask you what the difference is between the Russian kleptocrats and the American crony capitalists. Is there any difference at all that you see?
Only that the Russian kleptocrats were supported by Clinton's Democratic administration, and the American kleptocrats are now supported nominally under a Bush administration, but primarily by Mr. Obama and the Democrats, led by Barney Frank in the Congress and Nancy Pelosi. And by Reid. These are Democrats that must go, and if there's any sign of Mr. Obama keeping them on, then you know that the Democratic Party has been firmly captured by the Democratic Leadership Committee, that is Wall Street's lobbying group within the Democratic Party.
Well, now, since you've brought up Barack Obama, he was the one that lobbied for the passage of this, wasn't he?
That's correct. And the amazing thing was that McCain did too. Last Friday, I was attending the American Monetary Institute conference in Chicago, and we had some of the smartest financial brains around at that, and it was at Roosevelt University, and we all went down to the Student Union to watch the debate. And let's take a look at what happened last Friday. The previous Thursday, Mr. McCain had said there might not be a Friday debate because he was going to suspend the campaign until he could straighten out Washington regarding the bailout. So he went to the White House. There was reportedly not very much that he said during the meeting, but the Republican congressional leader, Boehner, made some very good suggestions. He suggested that instead of the bailout, the government use the money to set up a bank insurance fund of, say, anywhere from $250 billion to the $700 billion that was mentioned. The insurance fund would lend money to banks in exchange for their preferred stock, and this fund would be financed by levying a insurance charge on the entire U.S. banking system, just like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation levies insurance rates on the banks. And on the rates that would be levied under the Republican proposal would have reflected the actual risks involved, so that if the banks got together and lobbied politicians and supported the political campaigns of politicians who wanted to deregulate the industry, that's fair enough, but let them pay the risks. Let them pay 1% or 2% or even 3% of their deposits for this, because that's what it would take for the government to bail out policies like Alan Greenspan and others have supported. Instead of supporting this plan, and instead of saying that he'd come to Washington to save American taxpayers from the giveaway, Mr. McCain did absolutely nothing. He was blamed by the media on Friday morning, Friday afternoon too, for saying, oh, he's come to disrupt a done deal. Look what happened. He went to the White House. Now you have the congressional Republicans opposing it. Mr. McCain could have said, absolutely, that's just what he's done because he's a maverick, and he's going to protect American taxpayers from the bipartisan attempt to both reflect the campaign contributions of their largest contributors, Wall Street, and he's not going to let it happen. He could have jumped in front of the parade, jumped in front of opposition to an act that a reported 90% of voters were supposed to oppose, and this would have put Mr. Obama on the defensive. McCain could have said, I'm opposing the giveaway and supporting taxpayers. Mr. Obama's the man who's giving it all away to Wall Street and his major campaign contributors. Look at what's happening with Mr. Rubin. There's no difference at all between his financial advisor, Robert Rubin, and the Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson. And instead, Mr. McCain shifted gears, reversed himself, gave in, and said, no, I'm supporting the plan too. So the result of the Friday debate, if you remember the first half hour, Mr. Lehrer kept trying to press both presidential candidates on how do you feel about the bailout? What do you think? And they talked about anything else, and Mr. Lehrer tried to be more polite, and finally he was laughing. And he said, aren't either of you guys going to answer my question? And both of them said no. Now, when they refused to give their position on the bailout to the American people, when they refused to take a position on a plan that most voters overwhelmingly oppose, and then they support the plan, this shows that they're just in the hands of their financial backers.
Could you briefly explain again how this insurance proposal would have worked and why it would have been preferable?
The government would have set up a fund, and the fund's money would have been provided to banks on the term that Warren Buffett earlier that week had made a $5 billion investment in Goldman Sachs. It would have lent money to banks on the condition that, number one, it wipes out the stockholders. If any bank would have borrowed from the insurance fund, that meant that it was doing so as a life and death matter, and either it would have sacrificed its common stock, or it would have made its common stock subordinate to repaying the government for the risk. The government would have charged a high rate of interest and a high fee for making the insurance payment, as any insurance company would have done. And instead of printing new treasury bonds to give away in exchange for these bad mortgages, it would have established simply a line of credit, which at first would have been the same thing, but the credit would have been repaid not only by the banks that borrowed, but by all the banks in the country paying insurance, essentially bank insurance. Instead of being an insurance fund for depositors, like the FDIC is, it would have been an insurance fund for the bank owners themselves, and the banks have been acting almost as a financial gang in pressing not only to support the Federal Reserve Chairman, who is a deregulator, and the Federal Reserve is supposed to essentially represent the interests of the commercial banking system, but the banks also now have supplied the Treasury Secretary, and the Treasury Secretary is not supposed to represent the banks. The Treasury Secretary is supposed to represent the public interest, and instead, Mr. Paulson is representing the banking interests, Wall Street, not the public interest, and so there's an inherent conflict of interest, and the system of checks and balances that are supposed to prevent a giveaway like this have been broken.
That's right. And you mentioned Warren Buffett, and I've noticed you mentioned the $5 billion he was putting into Goldman Sachs and other investments. He sets it up where he's got a good deal, and he gets 10% back every year and other things.
Yes, and he said the government should have done the same thing. And the Republican congressmen actually voted according to their ideology, not according to their campaign contributions, because they realized that what's the point of getting a political campaign contribution if voting for the giveaway is going to result in their voters voting against them anyway and voting them out of office. Their corruption in changing their votes has been so egregious that no amount of television advertising can wipe away the fact that the voters now know that they're bought and paid for. They're trying to pretend that they did it in order to help the upper middle class by insuring bank deposits not only for $100,000 but for $250,000. So all your listeners up there that thought they were worried that had more than $100,000 in the bank can now rest a little bit more secure. And there were a few other giveaways to the upper middle class. They had to have the pretense of doing something as an excuse for changing, but really the giveaway remains in place, and most American voters realize that this has been a giveaway with no quid pro quo.
One commentator noted after the Senate, the modified plan that passed the Senate, that most of the senators that voted against it were up for re-election in November.
That's right. If they want votes, they have to represent the popular position, and according to all of the press reports and the statements out of Washington, there has never been so much of a voter protest as there has been against this giveaway. The people seem to know very clearly when they're being given a line that just isn't true. And no amount of apology and pretense can cover up this obvious fact.
I'm speaking with financial economist and historian Dr. Michael Hudson. Today's show, The New Kleptocracy. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Now, is the government buying real assets or just worthless, toxic junk?
Well, no real assets will be bought at all, although the government will end up foreclosing on them. Let's say what the real problem is. The real problem is that the volume of mortgage debt far exceeds the ability of debtors to pay and the willingness to pay. Mr. Paulson's pretense, which is an absolute lie and which should lead him to criminal prosecution because he knows that it's a lie, is that the problem here is a liquidity problem. But it's not a liquidity problem. It's a bad debt problem. Suppose that people bought a house for $120,000 and have a full mortgage on it for that price, and suppose the house has fallen to $80,000. I know a number of houses like that. I know a professor in Western Illinois that had a house that she bought for $125,000. The highest bid she has it on $80,000, fully mortgaged. Dennis Kucinich tells me that the house next door to him in Cleveland, Ohio, was bought for $120,000, and now it's only worth $80,000. So this is typical. Now, imagine a bank responding to a borrower who wants to say, well, gee, I want to be able to pay my mortgage. Can you lend me enough money to pay my mortgage? What bank can be expected when already the house is 50% over mortgaged? Who is going to lend more mortgage than a property is worth? That era is over. No bank any longer is going to lend more money than a house is worth. And already, Mr. Paulson said that 5 million Americans are in arrears and facing foreclosure. The figure was then corrected by other economists to 10 million Americans in the coming year are going to lose their homes. Now, no amount of liquidity is going to provide them with the money to stay in if already they can't afford the mortgage. And in fact, the government is now supposed to make money, quote, for taxpayers, unquote, by coming in and acting as debt collector. Now, in order to make money for taxpayers, the government now has to come in and say, we're going to enforce the adjustable rate mortgages that are exploding in interest rates. You are now going to have to pay much higher interest rates, penalty rates, back fees and penalties, or we're going to throw you out of your house because we have to make money for taxpayers. We are now the collecting agents, not Countrywide Financial or Fannie Mae or Washington Mutual or the others. So the debts of homeowners will remain in place. The debts of cities and municipalities will remain in place. And all that happens is that the people who have the mortgages are supposed to be bailed out now because under Mr. Paulson's plan, as he wrote it, and the plan that the House originally rejected, the terms were that the government would buy the bad mortgages and bad debts from the banks and other investors and insurance companies for what they had paid for them. In other words, insurance companies will not take a loss for their bad investments. Banks won't take a loss for their bad investments. Hedge funds won't take a loss for their bad investments. Now, how many of your listeners would love to be able to say, gee, I made a bad stock market investment. I'd like the government to buy back these stocks that I bought that have gone down. That's not what the government's doing because these aren't the major campaign contributors. So this is the asymmetry, the inequity. And the irony is that the Democrats have supported this so strongly. A week ago, last Thursday, in the Wall Street Journal, Hillary Clinton, of all people, came out with a wonderful, wonderful plan. She said that the government should insist in rewriting the bankruptcy laws. She said the government should rewrite the mortgages down to the current market price, and the government should replace exploding interest rate mortgages with normal interest rates, or the teaser rates that had been signed. So she obviously knew what the right thing to do was, and that's the plan that would have worked. And yet she went and voted for the plan that came out when the Senate passed it on Thursday. So she met the criterion of evil that Milton described in Paradise Lost. Somebody who knows the right thing and yet does the wrong thing knowingly. That's also the definition of a crime. A criminal has to knowingly and consciously be making a mistake. And Hillary and the other Democrats, Obama, just about all of the Democrats who supported the bill, said, we don't like it, we know it's wrong, but we're voting for it because it's an emergency, and if we don't vote for it, the stock market will go down. Well, as you saw on Friday, the stock market did go down, and it'll continue to go down because foreign investors realize that this money that's being given away is going to flow out of the country very quickly, and that's going to put downward pressure on the dollar. And even if housing prices only fall another 20% or so, if the dollar declines by more, they're going to take a heavy loss that they simply can't afford to take.
Well, you know, Dr. Hudson, I was going to ask you if the plan, we'll refer to it that way, gives struggling homeowners the chance to refinance into long-term fixed-rate mortgages. And it sounds like, I mean, there's some sort of subterfuge in the media and some claims, and well, the plan's been mitigated and we fixed it and we put in something for homeowners. But that's not really true, is it?
No, it's not true at all. They said they will ask the banks, will you please give homeowners a break? Now, this is absolutely ridiculous. And it's very funny that while many of the Republicans and Democrats claim to appeal to Christians, what they're doing is the exact opposite of what you found in the Bible. For instance, in Matthew, there's one of the passages where Peter asks Jesus about forgiveness. And Jesus tells a story of a king whose official comes to him and owes him about 10,000 talents. And he can't pay. He said, I just don't have the money. And the king says, well, you have to pay the penalty. You will become my debt bond servant, and so will your family. You and your family are going to come into debt bondage to me. And the official threw himself down at the king's knees and said, I'm sorry, I'm a good man, please have pity on me. So the king had pity on him and said, okay, I'm going to relieve you. I'm not going to throw you in debt bondage. Pay me when you can. And then the official went out and found somebody who owed him about 1,000 talents, or a much smaller sum. And he said, now pay the money that you owe me. I have to pay the king. And the debtor didn't have the money. And so the official said, okay, I'm throwing you and your family into debt bondage. Well, he went around trying to collect all this money, and this frightened a lot of debtors. And the debtors went to the king and said, look, this official's coming and throwing everybody in jail and taking them into bondage in order to collect the debts to pay you. This is bad. So the king called the official in and said, look, I had pity on you, but you don't have pity and forgiveness on your debtors, so now I'm going to throw you into jail. And in this case, the king is like the U.S. Treasury Department forgiving the debts of Wall Street, saying Wall Street doesn't really have to pay. But now Wall Street and the banks are going and tightening the screws on the smaller debtors. And so technically, the government should say, well, gee, in view of your bad behavior, now that Countrywide and Bank of America and others are going to go around, and I'm already told that thugs are going around to the black neighborhoods in Brooklyn to try to scare people out of their houses to take over. The government should say, well, now that we see how it's working out, we're not going to lend you the money except on very extortionate terms that will reduce you guys to debt bondage. I'm amazed that in the South and the Bible Belt, nobody's looking at this passage from Matthew in the Bible that describes it. And in fact, let's get back to the point where under the emergency part of the Act, all of this this is done as if it had to be in a hurry. There easily could have been time for the Democrats to put in a bill letting judges renegotiate the mortgages. Nothing was done. They could have repealed the awful bankruptcy bill that the credit card companies and other bankers lobbied for so carefully a few years ago. And the government could have restored the favoritism to the debtors, 90% of the population, rather than to the creditors, the upper 10%. But it didn't do this. There was no bailout for the debtors, no renegotiation or lightening of the credit terms for them. There was nothing at all that was done.
Well, speaking of the vote in Congress, on Black Monday, September 29th, the Dow drops by 777 points after the first vote in the House of Representatives on the plan is defeated. Do you think that this vote was staged in the sense that congressional leaders know where the vote is before it's taken?
No, I think obviously the leaders didn't know. The leaders had all begged the congressmen to support the act because the leaders themselves had already arranged very heavy campaign contributions for themselves out of all of this, and they'd taken care of themselves. But the fact is that the individual congressmen knew not only that they weren't promised any cash on the table for themselves to sell out their voters to Wall Street, but they thought that even if the Democratic National Committee or the Republican Congressional Committee contributed money to their campaigns, no amount of television or media advertising could persuade the voters that they weren't crooks. And so the congressional leaders thought that other people, their subordinates, would obey them, and this was always a false hope. The leaders were surprised, but it was very clear from the very beginning on the part of the actual congressmen that they weren't going to support it because they'd already come out on the floor with such vehement opposition to the bill and pointing out exactly what was wrong with the bill, that it didn't have to be done in a hurry, that there was no attempt to solve the debt problem, which was the core of the thing, that it misrepresented the debt problem as a liquidity problem, and that it simply was to bail out Mr. Paulson's friends, who, of course, are the same people who contribute to the Democratic campaigns.
Well, then, if the people in Congress who initially voted no, then did understand the bailout bill. See, I was going to ask you if the politicians understood the problem in the bailout bill.
They seem to very well. They understand the problem is a debt problem, but the real problem for them is what's more important, to get money in their pockets and to sell out to their backers, or to represent what they think is right and what the voters think is right. The people who voted for the bill decided to sell out the public and vote against the public interest in their own interest and that of their backers.
So now what are you saying turned the no's around into yeses? Were they paid off?
An enormous amount of lobbying took place in the intervening week, and not only in terms of money to the campaigns of just a few people, and they only had to turn over, maybe 20 or 30 votes, but also the leadership went to the no voters and said, look, what's your pet project? Is it ecology? Is it the environment? We're going to put in environmental things. Do you want more FDIC coverage for the upper middle class among your voters, the people who can afford to contribute to your campaign? We'll give you that. Politicians call this a Christmas tree of something for everybody to persuade politicians that their pet hobbies or their pet concerns would be taken care of.
Well, in your opinion, then, were the politicians bought off cheaply?
Considering that there's an $800 billion giveaway to be followed by another